And I'd like to start by thanking Raven Property Group for sponsoring this webinar series, and for you for joining us again today. I'd also like to thank EM Communications, who are partnering us today in today's webinar. Today, we're going to look at some of the key issues associated with the EU, UK, and Russia in what I think you'll agree is sometimes a complicated relationship. We have a great panel, and today's discussion will be moderated by Tom Blackwell, CEO of EM Communications, a leading financial, corporate, and digital comms agency for the emerging markets. Tom, many thanks for putting this together. And I read that EM was recently named Best PR Agency in Europe. You must be very proud, and that must have been a great feeling.
Thank you very much, Alf. That's a very nice intro, and thanks to the RBCC for making this happen today. If you'll allow me, I'll give a few quick observations to sort of set the scene before we start our discussion. I was just today, as I was thinking about this webinar, I remembered back to early 2020, so not very long ago. Relations between Russia and Europe were definitely strained, but they had been for some time anyway. And so this was becoming the norm. Markets had more or less priced it in. And even Russian companies were thinking about doing IPOs for the first time as long as any of us can remember. In the UK, we'd sort of had 3 years of incessant talk about Brexit. But then, Brexit was sort of done more or less to some degree, and we even stopped talking about Brexit in the UK. And in the EU, whereas sort of previously there'd been all of this sort of speculation, would Brexit lead to some Grexit, Spexit, Italexit, and so on, even that issue seemed to have been taken off the agenda. And so 2020 was looking like it might be a rather predictable, and maybe even a kind of a boring year. What a difference a few months make, because now with COVID, I think the world's been turned on its head. Everything we believed and assumed pre-COVID is kind of now up for question. Will we eventually just go back to the way we were, or will the world look fundamentally different afterwards? Will there be new opportunities or new threats? And significantly to today's discussion, what does all of that mean for the business relations between the UK, EU, and Russia? Thankfully, it's not an easy question, but we have speakers who I think are the people who can help us try and unwrap these questions. We're very pleased to have Annette Kiobi, who's the Russia resident representative from the IMF, Vladimir Yakunin, who's the chairman of the DOC Research Institute, Regina van Fleming, who's a member of the board of directors of MTS and Sovcombank, Giorgio Caligari, who's chairman and CEO of Generali Russia and CIS, and last but not least, Stuart Lawson, director of RBCC and senior advisor at EY. So to kick off, I'd like to ask if maybe Annette can help us set the scene with a bit of world context of where we are today, and then we'll proceed with our discussion. So Annette, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Hi. To set the stage for our discussion today, I thought I'd present a few backward-looking slides to show you some stylized facts on the EU, UK, Russia trade and foreign direct investment. I'll then very briefly touch on how the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic is expected to affect global trade. And I'll finish with a few observations on the Russian authorities' economic support package and the extent to which this supports foreign direct investment. On trade, Russian imports have been growing briskly following the gradual recovery of the economy in 2015 on the back of a collapse in oil prices and Western sanctions. This is the black line in the first chart. It's a bit of an obvious point, but I think worth making. Trade turnover and import demand move in lockstep with domestic demand and economic growth. Trade with Europe, the blue part of the bars, has also begun to increase from the lows of 2015. Imports from the rest of the world, mostly comprising trade with Asia, has increased comparatively more. A look at the second chart. This is a snapshot of trade volumes with Russia's main trading partners in 2019. And what this shows, and this you won't be surprised by, that Europe is still Russia's leading trade partner. 46% of imports are from Europe. The EU accounts for 37% of those, and 48% of services to Russia. This is mostly in the form of tourist travel. Asian partners are increasing their trade with Russia. Russia is now importing 43% of imports from Asia, 6% from North America, and somewhere in the order of 0.5 to 3% from Latin America, Africa, and Australia. In terms of the product basket, no surprises here. The structure of trade and good has remained broadly unchanged since the 2000s. The Russians are mostly importing electrical machinery, computer products. This makes about 30% of the basket. The rest is vehicles and pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are actually the fastest growing import category in Russia so far from Europe, and this is up 33% in 2019 compared to 2018. On the foreign direct investment side, Europe is also Russia's main source of FDI. FDI stock in Russia increased following, again, the sanction shock in 2014. But FDI from Europe decreased somewhere in the order of 50%. The decline has been somewhat offset by an increase in FDI inflow from Asia. But FDI levels have not recovered to anywhere near pre-sanctions level. However, I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a Russia-specific story. We've seen FDI slow down in pretty much the rest of the world. Global FDIs are at their lowest levels since 2010. Part of the story is a sluggish recovery from the global financial crisis and corporate debt overhang, where firms basically are constrained in their pursuit of new investments. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but a feature of FDI to Russia and also to other large emerging perhaps possibly more nefarious ones. I think you're better placed to talk about this than we are. So how is the current conjuncture likely to affect trade and business relations? I don't want to dwell too much on this because I think you would have heard it from various sources, but I think it's worth saying that while the world economic outlook is grim, at least it feels now that the worst seems to be behind us. Admittedly, when I was thinking about this, the phrase "famous last words" did come to mind, but I thought I would put it out there. We're slowly exiting the exceptional situation of having deliberately shut down our economies. And this has obviously resulted in significant output losses. These are our projections from the April vintage of our World Economic Outlook. I won't belabor the individual forecasts as we're in the process of revising these numbers, and we'll be revising them down. But I thought I'd just quickly mention Russia. In April, we expected growth in Russia to be minus 5.5% in 2020. However, this doesn't take into account the agreement that was reached on production cuts with OPEC+. So this is likely to shave a little bit more from growth. However, I think Moscow at least, and possibly a lot of other regions, have reopened much faster than we anticipated. In Moscow, we've been let out of lockdown, I think, 2 weeks earlier. And from our reading of the news, regional governments are also significantly relaxation. So perhaps the decline in output will not be as deep as we forecast at this point. We expect a recovery to 3.5% in 2021. I think it's worth just pointing out that there's massive uncertainty around these forecasts, not only on the depth of the contraction, but also on the size and the speed of the projected recovery thereafter. I mean, we've all been talking about the alphabet soup of what's likely to come. And I think I just wanted to mention a few factors that are causing this uncertainty. Things like, the length of the pandemic, the length of lockdown, in the economics, the ease of reallocating factors away from contact-intensive sectors, the possibility of hysteresis and scarring from firm closures, and the exit of the labor force into unemployment. And also things like the impact of changes to strengthen safety in the workplaces, which will no doubt impinge on and increase business costs. There's been a lot of discussion as well on global supply chain reconfigurations. And as companies move from just-in-time management to, I guess, what is being called now just-in-case supply chains to increase resilience, this is likely to weigh on productivity and increase business costs. What we don't, or rather what we do know for sure, is that global trade will plummet. Domestic disruptions from COVID have been amplified globally due to, I guess, what we would characterize as a synchronized nature of this downturn. I think it's the first time, at least in kind of my history, that we've seen all economies slowing at the same time. I mean, if we think back to the global financial crisis, we had China growing in the order of 8–9%. So we don't have these kind of pushes to the global economy now. A little bit more on trade. Earlier in the year, the dislocations to trade were primarily from the interruption in in China's supply chains. But more recently, aggregate demand effects and collapse in cross-border tourism account for a larger role in the contraction of global trade. The WTO expects world goods trade to fall somewhere in the order of 13 to 30% in 2020, depending on the recovery. So some recovery is expected in 2021, but again, this depends heavily on the economic outlook and of course on any kind of geopolitical tensions that might develop. I'm sure it will be picked up in this discussion, things like US-China, not only trade wars, but I won't even call it what I would like to call it. I'll leave that to you guys to discuss. In addition to that, trade is likely to fall steeper in sectors with complex value chains, so particularly things like electronics, automotives, and of course services because of the transport and travel restrictions. In Russia, the shock initially resulted in some depreciation of the ruble, and with the decreased consumer import demand, with many Russians likely to vacation domestically, imports of goods and services will shrink by about 18% in 2020, according to our April projections. We forecast some rebound in 2021, so somewhere in the order of 8%. In addition to the negative impact on trade, we're likely to see FDI negatively impacted by the COVID shock. And here, I think the OECD has a very nice publication worth looking at if you like figures and statistics. The global FDI flows are expected to fall by more than 30% in 2020, even under the most optimistic scenario for the outlook. I'll turn to kind of the last few points I want to make, and it's more on the Russian response to this economic crisis, but from the FDI perspective. The government is currently developing a national plan for, the 140 pages that we've seen has some mention of investment support, but it's not clear at this stage what that form will take. In a lot of discussions we've had with businesses, they felt that the initial policy package to support the economy didn't do enough for foreign businesses. There were a number of complaints that foreign firms that were Russian legal entities and are systemically important didn't qualify for all the government support measures, and foreign SMEs had an even worse lot. And I think the point we want to make from an institutional perspective is that FDI obviously is very crucial to long-term economic growth, and even in the short term could play an important role in supporting economies right after the crisis through financial support, through affiliates and linkages with local firms. I'd like to say we have been having these consultations, and we've recommended in many of our staff reports, even before the COVID crisis, that the authorities work on reducing barriers to trade in FDI. But given the geopolitical juncture and the economics with decreases in globalization to be likely, and understandably the desire to diversify and perhaps even localize supply chains, I think this is going to be much easier said than done. With this, thank you, and I hand over to Tom.
Annette, thank you very much indeed. That's brilliant. I mean, it provides us with some great context and sort of data points to provide a bit of a framework for our discussion from here. So with that, I think I'd like to come to Regina actually for the first question. So, you're in the EU. The EU sits between UK and Russia, or at least after Brexit happens. So what's your take in terms of the state of business relations today, both from a European perspective and then to the extent that you see a differentiation, maybe a specific German differentiation in terms of relationship with Russia?
Thank you, Tom. I want to follow up on Annette's comment about the FTI. Just a couple of figures. The German direct investment 2018 in Russia were 3.3 billion euro out of the chart you've shown, Annette. And in 2019, 2.1 billion euros, so record investments in Russia. Having said so, the trade balance went down. So now the biggest trade partner in Eastern Europe is Romania for Germany. It's not Russia any longer, which is quite amazing, but goes back to supply chain and automotive. I totally agree with Annette's comment, and this is a big argument for German direct investment in Russia, that the local or localization due to the sort of hazard in a global supply chain will, in my perspective, enhance foreign direct investments in Russia, because those companies already producing here will try to attract more and more their supply chain and localize them as well. So I think the disruptive global supply chain might be turning out into a plus for Russian investments, as well as labor costs went down. We all know that they're now in some regions lower than Chinese labor costs. And the second point, which I see here, is that Germany is in a very tricky situation, and always what happens in the US tackles our political sort of relationship with the Russian Federation. So despite of political mentioning of the German government that we have our friends in the US, our friends sometimes see our friendship a little bit different. They go on a next wave of sanctions against the insurance companies for Nord Stream 2, which means now it's coming to an ultimate status, as well as the so far not officially confirmed but already announced troops removing from US troops removing from Germany. So I think next year will be an interesting year on a political level on the German-Russian relationship. We all understand that Mrs. Merkel, who, by the way, handled the crisis, the corona crisis, in a very, very sufficient and professional way, she will be going out of power, and now it's the threshold, what's gonna next? Because we all understand that politically the Ukrainian question needs to be solved, Minsk II, but on the other hand, we are the biggest direct investment community nationwide, so therefore we always had a strong voice, which was demonstrated last night when the German business community could come home to Moscow or home to Russia with a special flight of Lufthansa. I think the Russian government gave a very strong signal that the German community is more than wished and welcomed here as investors. Having said so, if the sanctions are going on from the US, it will be difficult for us as well. But we are a little bit losing out our strong position to France, because the President Macron made a very smart move before the coronavirus, moving towards Russia. So I hope that when the German economy comes back to shape, that the German government will come back to its sort of coordinating, or as you say in Russian, Обменный пунkt between the US and Russia, and takes a little bit politically the role back, which always gives also a second wave of direct investments and trade enhancement. We hope that it's going to moving. So we have a special position, yes, but here we are a little bit more dependent on international relationships.
Thank you very much, Regina. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Giorgio, if I may. And Giorgio, you run Generali in Russia, which has been a very active player in Russia and a very significant investor in the market. What is your take in terms of the relations that you see at the moment, and some of the key issues that you see as of today?
Thanks a lot, Tom. Well, I think that if you allow me a couple of general comments before getting into specific ones. The general one that comes to mind is the fact that what Russia called localization is now, I would say, the general trend in all over Europe. Because basically, thanks to the impressive economic packages that have been approved by various governments, what is being done is aim those packages at companies that will invest in the country where they are based. So in a way, it's a sort of a European version of localization. That will certainly play a big role in the way that the economy bounce back from the current challenging situation. And, we've seen that discussion happening certainly on the pharmaceutical side, but if you follow, linking my comment to what Regina was saying about the car industry, large car manufacturers have been asked if they want support to stay in Italy, if they want support to stay in France, if they're French, and so on. So be prepared to see more inward-focused investment by European companies. That's the general comment I would like to make. The second one I would like to make is that, in my opinion, it's important that we agree on the definition of what is foreign direct investment. In the sense that if I develop industrial capacity in Russia, yes, initially with the foreign capital, but then with capital which is readily and easily available in Russia, then is that a foreign direct investment, or is, I say, a foreign entrepreneurship ready to invest in Russia? I think it's more of the latter, and I think that's a very positive sign, as a direction that we're seeing in Russia. So as Russia remains a very big market with a lot of potential, there are companies in different segments, from service industry, from service to industry to manufacturing to chemicals and so on, that are looking at Russia as an area of opportunity. Because we just heard from IMF what the forecast is in terms of GDP decrease in Russia in 2020 and rebound in 2021, and those are numbers that are significantly better than the numbers we're looking at in Italy, that the numbers we're looking at in overall Europe. So in that respect, I think that Russia will remain a target of development. Will that translate into significant amounts of foreign direct investment? I don't know, because I think that the combination of opportunities and local market development will probably lead to calculate those investments in a different way, but I certainly believe that opportunities are there. As far as a more specific focus on Italy-Russia, I think that the relationship has always been very good on political as well as economic and industrial terms, and the reciprocal support that has been offered by the countries at the peak of the coronavirus. Let's not forget that Italy was the most severely hit country for a number of weeks with the highest number of deaths, and Russia came to our support with sending medicines, sending doctors, sending nurses, and that will be remembered. So in terms of relationship, I think that country to country are very good, and in terms of opportunities for investment, Italian companies will continue to look at Russia as a market for development. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. And with that, Vladimir Ivanovic, perhaps I can come to you. I mean, some of the opportunities have been highlighted here, but as well as some of the clear challenges that continue to persist. How do you see this at this stage? And do you see some potentially some light at the end of the tunnel with some of the things that have held back trade and relations in the past years? Just you're on mute.
I suppose we're all on the same platform, and we are going to find the end, the light at the end of the tunnel. We hope to see this light, but I suppose it is should be considered very, may I say, objective about the collaboration. People and political figures, they are praising this collaboration. On the other side, we can see absolutely different approach, considering that something wrong about this kind of collaboration and praising the Russian participation in terms of political considerations, if you know what I mean. But as I said, I truly hope to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But the situation in which we are living today, that is the situation we should assess very objectively. And we need to understand the challenges which we are facing. From this point of view, I suppose it is more and more increasingly is going to be clear that we need some kind of new development model. Regina knows my views, you know, since World Public Forum. It was not just, you know, today that I'm saying about this new model. We were elaborating on this model in DOC and the World Public Forum for long. But, you know, through these several months, it became absolutely obvious that, you know, the existing model of development, globalization, seems not to be sustainable. It's not only me saying that, but, you know, I can refer to the Nobel laureate Stiglitz, for example, or, you know, experts of Rome Club. I suppose we're all living in this actual world. So, you know, at the same time, as you said, this coronavirus crisis can produce or provide as possibilities also some kind of challenges. And speaking about challenges, I suppose we observed a lot of some kind of discord, suspicious, finger pointing, which I mentioned already in terms of collaboration with Italy, for example, on the part of Russia. And that was as much as the attempt to go for solidarity, for unanimous reaction or unity in reaction to coronavirus. So it is like both ways possible. And what is also very important, you know, when we are talking about comprehensive EU policy towards the development of relations, business relations between Russia and Europe, I suppose it is more feasible to talk about bilateral development of the relations. Because, you know, somehow, even in the existing, you know, governance model, we observe clashes between the parties. And that is also true if we are talking about the development of relations between European countries and Russia. One more aspect, you know, I suppose the atmosphere was spoiled in a way. And if you talking about Russia, or if you are Russian, then immediately, you consider to be toxic in all ways of collaboration. And I suppose this situation should be changed. And here I would like to praise RBCC attempt to develop the relations between two, you know, communities, business communities as part of the general community. This is very important. But I finish with the statement that, listen, I am considered to be a clinical optimist. And though, you know, nowadays this optimism is a little bit, you know, hurt by all the situation, I still looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for ending with some words of optimism. It gives us hope. And with that hope, I'm coming over to Stuart, actually. And so I wonder if you can, this is going to be a difficult question, but I believe you're up to it. I wonder if you can help us think through, you know, sort of what's going through the minds of Whitehall at the moment. So, you know, I'd point out that Boris Johnson just several months ago said that China was going to be a great friend and ally to the government. Now, just a few months later, it seems to be a rather different picture. So he is capable of changing his mind on things, it seems. And so the relationship with Russia is very difficult, as we know, but maybe after Brexit, maybe things look different. And so what do you think they look like? And is there a chance for a bit of a shift after Brexit is done, as they say?
Oh, well, okay, thanks, Tom. That's a really easy question. Yeah, appreciate that opportunity. What's in the mind of Boris Johnson? Perhaps you'd like me to extend it. What's in the mind of Donald Trump? You know, we've got 5 minutes, so we can sort of cover both, I should think. I mean, first of all, I am completely confused. I mean, I'm confused anyway, but I'm particularly confused at the moment because I've spent 82 days locked in on the basis of science. You know, I was quietly told in a quiet way by all these very smart people that this is what we had to do. You needed 2 meters, you needed to stay home to start with. And now we've got all of this contradictory advice. And so just looking at where the world is going from this point forward, the concept of uncertainty that Net was referring to lies across everything out there in the future. Because there's one pricing model and there's one scenario that says we've done it, we're the other side of it, and there's another now, you know, for those of us that aren't optimists, there's another which is the second wave, and what is the impact of that as that comes through. I mean, if you look specifically at Brexit, I was listening to the CBI broadcast earlier this week. You know, the problem is that they need to be really focused on getting this thing done. It was already mission impossible in terms of the number of elements that had to come together. And into that very complex environment, you had the virus appear. This reduced the bandwidth of the people who are actually involved in the day-to-day negotiation. And really, by the end of June, they have to have absolutely committed to the end of December. And the deal has to be basically done by September. And you're talking about tariffs, you're talking about, you know, people movement. These are very complex things that have to happen. Now, in a world that didn't have the virus, you may have said, okay, that's sort of doable. But now on top of that, you have Merkel taking over at the European Commission. You have, in terms of the presidency, you have 750 billion euro that needs to be allocated across the different countries. And that's going to be taking up, again, a lot of the bandwidth. So how the Brexit deal gets done in a way that it's done the way people would like it to be in a sort of orderly fashion seems a really major challenge. What happens with the UK and Russia going forward? Let's say that one way or another Brexit will happen, whether it's a no-deal Brexit or a negotiated Brexit. You know, we've agreed we're out by January next year. If you are the UK government, if you are a UK business, you will be looking for whatever business you can find within the parameters that you've got. And you know, one thing I'd want to make the point on is sanctions. It's very interesting. We could have a whole another discussion on what was the real impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Was it beneficial, in fact, in some respects? But the fact is that there are plenty of SME companies, plenty of manufacturing companies who aren't impacted by sanctions. And I think the real problem for much of the perspective on Russia is that UK companies view Russia through the prism of the front pages, through the prism of what they regard as sanctions affecting everything. And one of our jobs in our BCC, thank you, Mr. Yukun, for saying those positive words. Yes, it's one of our principal goals is to communicate the opportunities, to have trade missions, and to make sure that the reality of what's happening on the ground in Russia is put across to the UK companies. I've always said, all you have to do is get the UK company into Russia, into Moscow, and then they'll understand that some of those headlines that they're reading aren't the reality on the ground. Of course, the challenge we face at the moment is, you know, mobility. How are we going to get people, how are we going to get this thing restarted when there are challenges on actually crossing borders? I guess I've got to say this, excuse me, everybody, but it would be not, and I understand the background, I just would love Britain to be included in the electronic visas that come in next year. I know what the counter to that is, by the way, so But it will certainly, that will certainly help in terms of both business and tourism. So I think that Russia, the other thing that, looking at it from the other end of the telescope, Russia was already in stagnation. So it needs foreign direct investment, already had identified it as critical, already had seen that productivity was one of the major challenges. And I think the world, I don't know about you, but I feel like days were put in the mixer and everything was kind of blended in for the last 3 months. There's been a sort of ceasing in the activity other than that's focused on virus, dealing with the virus. And it's time now for us to look over into the future and think about how to re-engage. So actually, I'm quite positive because I think that the economic necessities will mean that the UK will start to readdress the Russian marketplace.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And it was a difficult question, but I feel it was addressed with finesse. So with that, I'd like to, you've led us into the next round, which is the future. It's looking into the future. And I'll come back to Regina here to sort of outline in a way, if you think about the next 3 to 5 years, what are the big opportunities, but what has to be done for us to actually be able to achieve them?
Thank you, Tom. But first of all, I'm a little bit worried about the Russian national situation because I think November, December will be a very crucial sort of step for Russian economy to see if the government really sort of provides those companies who are in need. I'm especially worried about the regions, frankly speaking, and SME businesses as well as some sort of core industries. And of course, it didn't help to start an oil fight, I want to call it that way, which was also not helping the ruble. So I'm a little bit worried about the national sort of development. Plus on top, again, what we hear, and election campaign started yesterday in the US, Trump already sort of disagreed with the 14% advantage in the statistics for Mr. Biden at the moment. So this will be a tough year ahead. And due to the fact that we have no stability at the moment, even on our feet or beyond or around us, I think attracting foreign direct investment, those who are already invested will further invest. They believe in the country. I totally agree with Stuart, bring people over, let them see and feel how it is to be great. I think it's a great initiative of Vnesh Econom Bank, WEB. They are starting now a huge program in order to enhance direct investment and co-financing, not equity, but establishing also one-shop window. I think it's a great initiative. But again, the macro political landscape, and here I agree with Vladimir Yakunin, all these topics are not new. And we are at the threshold at the moment how we create now the future. And it's either A or B. I think Russia has great chances now to step into sort of ESG topics. I think it's a good chance for also investments which are definitely needed, which are needed also for the international capital markets to be shown. And so I think there are opportunities, but again, it needs a little bit sort of smoothening the political landscape in the 3 blocks between US, Europe, Russia, and here, of course, also China. So I'm optimistic for Russia as always, but I have my question marks for the national development in the next couple of months, because especially in the regions, I think it's going to be tough.
Thank you, Regina. And one thing I will remind our audience that we should have a few minutes at the end for a couple of questions. And so if there are any, feel free to write them in the chat function and we will do our best to address them. But with that, I'll come back to Giorgio, actually. I mean, Giorgio, when it comes to forecasting Russia, nobody's crystal ball is very clear, but I think that yours is probably the clearest I know. So take us into the future, how you see it.
I did buy a few of those crystal balls, so I can offer them at a rebate if anybody wants to buy them. No, I think I'm definitely much more optimistic than some of the co-panelists. The following sense, one of the things I have a privilege of being busy with is also energy production. As I chair the board of Enel in Russia. Well, I'm proud to say that, and here I'm speaking not about the company, but about the country, that the level of investment that the country is putting into modernizing existing power plants, into offering tenders for renewables energy is such that the Enel Group, which is one of the biggest energy generator worldwide, has just confirmed that there will be more investment into Russia. So the point is, there is, in my opinion, this is very different from a number of other countries. There is a long-term vision which is unique to Russia, possibly typical of what also China does. But sometimes this is considered to be negative because it's possibly conditioned by large state enterprises. But I also see that as a big opportunity for a number of international players. When the project for LNG in Yamal was launched, one of the largest winners of subcontracting was an Italian company. So again, there are lots of opportunities already existing. And let's not forget, if I may, that the Russian government just confirmed its readiness to continue with the national project. The national projects have been sized at something around $500 billion over 10 years. And that's more than what current European governments are investing to sustain their economy. So once again, I do agree that direct involvement, foreign direct involvement is important, but are we legally seeking investment, or are we seeking know-how, let me say, contribution? I think, again, it's more of the latter. So just to complete answering your question, because I'm not trying to avoid it, I see a situation where if not for lack of better alternatives, international players will continue to come to Russia. It's true that what Regina was saying, there certainly wasn't a need for an oil price war, but on the other hand, it's also true that that price war was resolved over a space of basically 6 weeks. So once again, I think that Russia is proving to have the ability in the political cloud to make a mess and then possibly to address that mess, which is for an international investor always very important, because it means that there is a possibility of having a serious conversation and then address the issues and solve them. And finally, again, everywhere we look, so from the financial markets to the energy production markets to other markets, I think that Russia is implementing a set of regulations which, in our opinion, facilitate broadening the market to a larger number of players. So I see many more opportunities than challenges for the upcoming years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So Vladimir Ivanovich, perhaps I can come back to you here, and I'll give you actually a bit of a two-part question here in one way. So one way or another, we understand that we are still in a bit of a political deadlock. And I wonder if you have thoughts as to how we can possibly try to unlock that situation, which will one way or another continue to be something of a barrier to achieving some of these things that we've been talking about here. And the second part is also, you talked a little bit about how you felt that there needs to be a new model, a new development model, and questions around globalization and so on. Do you have any preliminary thoughts as to how you see that, as to what that new model might look like?
Listen, it is, of course, very difficult to talk in a very short presentation about the possible model, but I suppose it is obvious that what we actually need to restore a very objective and, may I say, respectful dialogue between different sides, even if we disagree on something, because dialogue is an essential element to construct new model and new relations. And from this point of view, I suppose the second principle should be pragmatism. And I don't need to remind you that in 1924, for example, the Great Britain was one of the first countries to recognize Soviet Russia. And that was not because, you know, they liked Bolshevik or they liked ideology. No, that was very pragmatic. In terms of Brexit, I suppose, this pragmatism should prevail because, you know, a lot of tensions on different sides in negotiations about the Brexit, like Stuart was talking just now, or about the possible obtaining the possibility to come to the huge Russian market. Where is the pragmatism? I suppose it should be addressed. And I should say that, you know, we have too much ideology in all the aspects of our relations. So I suppose pragmatism, again, should prevail over ideologies. Sure, you're absolutely correct, saying that sometimes businessmen, they are obtaining information from the front page, you know, stories of the newspapers. And I'm not going to elaborate about the quality of these, you know, pages, but, you know, when people are actually coming to some other places and see the real life, you know, their understanding is greatly changing. I remember, you know, my period in RGD when we were constantly going to London to participate in infrastructure conferences, when we were introducing our bonds there, and the interest on the part of the British business was not big, it was huge. And that was very pragmatically beneficial to all the sides. Now the situation changed. I suppose the atmosphere changed greatly, and that was the result of the previous, you know, situation, but it should change. On the other hand, I would like to remind, I'm not challenging what Annette, you know, described in terms of trade relations between Russia and different countries in Europe and Europe, but I would like to remind you that the initiative of the sanctions belong to the United States of America. At the same time, the US are one of the most, if not the most significant direct investor into the Russian economy. I remember, you know, like 3 first years of the sanctions, you know, while the collaboration, trade relations between Europe and Russia declined like 20%, the, you know, the trade between Russia and the United States of America rise 10%. So I don't think it is fair. And from this point of view, considering the interest of European companies, I suppose they just, you know, were put into position that they were buying the, you know, the results of this sanction policy on their own shoulders. And I don't think this is fair and that is correct. Of course, Russia and Russians should make a lot of efforts, and I suppose you all know the situation in Russia, to, you know, to improve the investment climate. This is also necessity. So it is, you know, double way feature, double way considerations how to improve the relations from both sides.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's, you know, I think that that's a very interesting point about the almost the US sort of conundrum where stronger sanctions, but actually a lot of the US companies have been rather pragmatic and found ways to continue to press ahead in a way that maybe some Europeans have not. Stuart, Vladimir Ivanovich was remembering back to days of being in London and bonds and big conferences. If you remember, the biggest Russian economic conference used to be in London, you know, some years ago. Those days feel like a very long time ago. But, you know, within RBCC, I know that you spend a lot of your time trying to look at the different opportunities between UK, Russia. Where are they? Which sectors? Where can you find these link-ups? And so, again, looking into the future, what do you think are some of the, potentially, some of the most interesting areas that can be seized?
Yeah, I think I've just got to make a couple of quick comments. One is, I think there's this tension between the supply chains that have been broken and localization that we've been talking about. And yes, on the other hand, we had a global attack. It wasn't a geographic attack between one country, and even if some people are trying to make it that way, it was actually, you know, the virus versus the world. And to a large extent, what one hopes is that it will be the world versus the virus in terms of working on the vaccine, in terms of sharing medical science. So I completely agree with Giorgio when he says, you know, maybe it's the know-how that's the important element. But I would also have to point out that around the world, there's now the concept of technological sovereignty. The world is understanding how valuable data is. We see are not focused on Russia, or all around the world, protectionism coming in terms of putting up virtual barriers and imposing virtual restrictions to control that element. So there's a tension there that needs to get resolved one way or the other. The second thing I want to make a comment on, which is a general comment, is, as you could tell from my previous remarks, I'm extremely positive towards Russia. I have to bring up the Calvi case. I have to bring it up, not because I'm a foreigner in Russia, but because talking about the foreign investment climate, that is one of the things that foreign investors look at. It isn't, by the way, just because of Philippe and Michael. It's an issue for any of the Russians who are caught up in the same sort of processes. I think a lot of focus went on those two individuals, but the reality is it's a problem, and it's accepted as a problem that needs to get dealt with. Everybody knows it's still out there, and I think it's something, it would be wrong not to at least talk about it at some point. In terms of where do we go? Well, as I mentioned already, you know, science, I think there's plenty of opportunities there. I've been involved with the City UK and the Moscow International Financial Center, Mr. Voloshin and his team. And actually, we've been working hard throughout this process, along with the RBCC. And we've had some very valuable conferences, both in terms of fintech, but also alongside Skolkovo, most recently in Cambridge, where we've had very fruitful discussions to look at the whole area of digital health and the whole approach to modern city life. Perhaps because I recognize we're running out of time, I did want to just raise one other thing, which is, you know, this isn't all about business. It's also about the linkages between the countries. And I asked, I just checked in with the embassy about how did the year of music go? Because as you know, these have been the years of culture between Britain and Russia. Very interestingly, that year of culture was actually launched in 2014, which was, of course, the year when the sanctions came in. And the point was that this was seen to be a separate initiative, separate from those political issues. And last year, during the year of music, 235 events with 500 UK artists in 34 Russian cities took place. And I think, okay, and of course it actually rolled into 2020. Well, something got in the way of that. But I still think that it's remarkable. It just shows that there's plenty of room for communication between them. And not just room, an appetite for communication between the two countries.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And, you know, I think you raised a couple of kind of key issues there. And I think, you know, you're very, very right to continue to bring up the issue of Michael Calvi and colleagues, because, you know, we're all optimists on this call and we're all heavily invested in Russia and we all see the big opportunity. But as long as that continues to be the case, as long as they continue to be locked down, this casts a shadow, and we hope this is something that can be resolved. We have literally just a few minutes left before we finish, and I see there's one question that's come in from the floor, and so I'll read out the question and invite any of our speakers to address it. Question is about FDI into Russia, where it's from Trevor Lewis, saying that no doubt that Russia can compete when it comes to human capital, but can it compete when it comes to cost base, you know, particularly, for example, if you compare it to Asia? Would any of our speakers like to have a crack at that question? In a way, Regina, I think that you touched on this in your remarks, and so perhaps you'd elaborate.
Yeah, I don't want to start now because I'm not prepared on figures, but I can only quote now foreign investors that the labor costs in for example, automobile are cheaper in Russia nowadays than in China. The supply chain, and a couple of my co-panelists mentioned it already, is a really crucial one. So here I think also in a mix with regions which are so far not developed for foreign direct investment, which are now underway to attract investment and learn how to deal with foreign investors. I can only quote, I've learned that FDI in Russia makes more sense logistic-wise, as well as closer to the already invested companies than Asian investments. But again, this goes from industry to industry, but I see high potential again in supply chain or suppliers to automotive. I see, because we have the existing big investments, I see also lots in pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and pharmaceutical sub-licensing, because we have the law coming up for pharmaceutical products 21, that it should be localized, and the amount of localization. I see lots of potentials in the agriculture sector, forestry. So in a nutshell, not answering with figures, only with quotes I've heard and learned.
Thank you. Yes, Giorgio.
Can I offer a direct experience? There are 4 large Italian companies that have started exporting from their plants in Russia to neighboring markets. So that's a reality, which means that manufacturing in Russia, from tires, and you can guess the name, to cables, to pasta, actually, to agricultural products, has become more convenient if done in Russia than not if done in other parts of Europe and then exported to neighboring countries. So it is true that manufacturing in Russia, if, as Stuart and other colleagues were saying, efficiency is brought up to international standards, it can be more convenient than in other markets.
Thank you very much.
If I may, one sentence?
Yes, absolutely.
Just to kind of finish up on this. We've done some analytical work that kind of looked at exactly this, but the one caveat I want to put on the table is that while the cost base, is quite low, and then kind of riffing off what Giorgio said about Russian manufacturing being exported to neighboring countries, I think that's exactly right. But the reason the math works is because these neighboring countries are part of the Eurasian the Eurasian Economic Union, so there's no import tariffs. What we found is that the biggest cost to kind of manufacturing in Russia has been exactly the fact that they're not part of regional trade arrangements. They don't have a very kind of long, deep value chains, the same way Poland has with Germany, the same way Mexico has with the US through NAFTA and all of that. So this is where the cost disadvantage is for Russian firms. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for a good addition there, Annette. And so we're at 6 o'clock. I know that Regina has a board meeting starting at 6, and I promised her we would end on time and be disciplined. And so, as a man of my word, let me thank all of our speakers, and Stuart, Vladimir Ivanovich, Alf, Giorgio, Regina, Annette, and thank you to RBCC and also to Raven Russia for making this possible, and wish everyone a nice long weekend, to the extent that we still have weekends.
Thanks to you for chairing it so effectively, Tom.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.